Okay, lots of good questions. So we have a question. What do you think about the idea of carbon labeling for goods and services similar to a nutrition label on food products? I know this is something that Climate Earth thinks a lot about too.
So I think carbon labeling as a concept is great. I think the adoption of it is going to be a little bit more difficult. There's a supermarket in the UK that is currently working on getting as many of the products on their shelves carbon labeled, and one of the first was Walker's potato chips, and they have a great website talking about their products' greenhouse gas emissions. But the problem is that displaying greenhouse gas emissions, just like displaying trans fat on a package, is negative, and consumers might be turned off by the fact that they know that this product has a negative impact, either on their health or on the environment, as is the case with carbon labeling. So companies are kind of in a difficult position here. On the one hand, they might appear to be green in terms of managing their greenhouse gas emissions by disclosing publicly, but on the other hand, they might be exposing themselves to some sort of risk in this way.
Okay, we'll go on to the next one. Are there any emerging trends in terms of which emissions companies are including Scope 3 calculations?
So the emissions that are included under Scope 3 calculations are entirely up to the company that's calculating their own emissions. I've seen companies include only business travel, and I've seen companies go as far as including employee commutes, which traditionally has not been the responsibility of companies, since the employee would have to commute to another job if that company were not in existence. So those emissions aren't directly tied to the company, but a lot of companies have taken ownership over that. So there's no set standard that companies can follow, and this leads to a lot of confusion. We're not counting apples to apples when we're talking about a Scope 3 inventory. Scope 3 is simply a catch-all for all the emissions that a company feels responsible for that are not accounted under Scope 1 and 2. Some voluntary programs out there might ask companies to include certain emissions that traditionally fall under Scope 3, but that's still a rarity at this point.
Going down the list, are U.S. carbon credits exchangeable or usable in the EU?
So as far as I know, U.S. carbon credits are not eligible for use in the EU except for voluntary purposes. So U.S. credits that are developed through the voluntary markets in the U.S. can't be used in the compliance markets in Europe. But if you generate credits in the U.S. and happen to find a buyer in Europe that wants to purchase those credits in order to alleviate their own guilt over emissions, or for some other reason other than compliance, then that's fully acceptable.
Okay, here's one, Pablo. If credits are generated in supply chain initiatives, won't those credits belong to the supplier?
That's an excellent question, and with a lot of these ownership questions around greenhouse gas emission offset credits, the real question is what has been contractually documented. So companies in the supply chain may already be undertaking greenhouse gas emissions reduction, in which case the company would not be able to claim greenhouse gas emissions reduction credits. But if the company asked some of its suppliers to reduce their emissions and maybe helped fund those emissions and wrote that into a contract, then by all means those credits could be generated by that company. So Walmart, not that they are, but they could generate carbon credits through actions that their suppliers undertake with funding and contractual arrangements with those suppliers.
Okay, here's a great one. What is the impact of the recession and the recent stimulus bill on climate change?
So first of all, let me talk about carbon credits. Since the global financial markets collapsed, the global carbon credits have, the prices of global carbon credits have decreased as well. The European trading of carbon credits under the Kyoto system has reached under, I believe, $8 at last check, maybe even lower, from a high of over 35. So that's quite a drastic fall. And part of this is that with a reduction in demand for products, companies have also reduced their emissions. Therefore, they don't have to buy compliance credits, meaning that there's more credits available on the market. So with supply and demand, the prices go down. The impact on climate change as a whole is to some degree good because the demand for oil does go down, and that means that there's less combustion of oil. But this is almost offset by the development of emerging economies where people are buying a lot of cars where they previously were not as widespread. China is a good example. Beijing adds about 1,000 cars to its road every day, even under this economic downturn.
Here's a really interesting one. We do all of our business online. How can we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions even more?
Well, a lot of businesses that work online are dependent on the ICT sector. That's basically big, huge servers that have a large energy requirement to run the computers and then also to cool the computers with air conditioning equipment. There's a lot that can be done to improve the efficiency of these server farms, and that would be one great start. I'm guessing that your business does have offices, and those emissions, from electricity use and whatnot, are also a good candidate for reduction as well.
Let's see. Here's a question that we at Climate Earth answer a lot, so it'll be fun to hear your answer to this too. Is including all Scope 3 double counting? So if I take credit for my injection molders emissions, and so do they, then have we double counted these emissions?
That is a very excellent question, and one that I love contemplating and discussing with people. The short answer is yes, it is double counting. Any Scope 3 emissions, whether it's air travel, and in the case of air travel, you're using the services of an airline, and they are a corporate entity that might account for their greenhouse gas emissions. They would account for their emissions under Scope 1 and 2, whereas your portion of those emissions would go under your Scope 3 accounting. So yes, there is double counting, but the point is that you need to get a more complete picture of the direct and indirect emissions that your company is causing throughout its supply chain in order to manage those emissions.